Hello dear friends and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day treated you? Perhaps you're settling into evening wherever you are in the world, or maybe you're finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day to pause and breathe. Whether you're listening from a bustling city or a quiet countryside, from the mountains or by the sea, you are welcome here. What time is it where you are right now? Are you watching the sun set through your window, or perhaps the stars are already painting the sky above you? No matter where you find yourself in this beautiful world we share, you've found your way to this sacred space, and I'm so grateful you're here. If this story brings you peace tonight, I'd be honoured if you'd consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. Your presence in our community means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing these timeless stories that remind us of hope, faith, and the gentle strength that carries us through life's seasons. Now let's settle in together for tonight's story. Take a deep breath with me. Let your shoulders drop. Let your heart rest. Tonight, we journey to an ancient land, to a time of great drought and scarcity, where we'll meet a widow whose small act of faith would echo through the ages. This is the story of bread in the drought, the story of the widow of Zarephath. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Israel, its rays sharp as bronze swords piercing through air that shimmered with heat. Not a cloud had crossed the sky for months, and the land lay barren and broken, crying out for relief that would not come. This was the drought that Elijah had prophesied, the drought that would bring a proud king to his knees and teach a nation that there was still a God in Israel. Elijah moved like a shadow across the wilderness, his weathered feet finding paths where others saw only desolation. His dark hair hung long and wild, his beard streaked with dust from countless days of wandering. The rough camel's hair that wrapped around his lean frame had become his second skin, and the leather belt at his waist held the simple tools of a man who had learned to survive on little. But Elijah was no ordinary wanderer. He was a prophet of the Most High God, and his words had the power to shut up the heavens themselves. When he had stood before King Ahab in his glittering palace, surrounded by the false prophets of Baal and Asherah, Elijah had spoken with the authority of heaven itself. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Those words had sealed his fate as a fugitive. Ahab's rage had been swift and terrible, and Queen Jezebel's thirst for the prophet's blood was legendary throughout the land. So Elijah had fled, following the voice of God that whispered to him in the wind, that spoke to him in the silence of the wilderness, that guided his steps away from the palaces of men and toward the humble places where faith still flickered like a candle in the darkness. For months God had provided for his prophet in the most unlikely ways. By the brook Cherith, ravens had brought him bread and meat morning and evening, their black wings carrying sustenance from heaven itself. Elijah had learned to read the language of divine provision, to trust in a God who could command the birds of the air and the streams of the earth to serve his purposes. But as the drought deepened and the brook dried up, God's voice came to Elijah again, gentle but unmistakable. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Zarephath. The name itself meant refining or smelting place, a fitting destination for a prophet who was learning daily what it meant to be refined by fire, to have the dross of self-reliance burned away until only faith remained. It was a small coastal town in Phoenicia, in what we now call Lebanon, far from the borders of Israel and the reach of Ahab's soldiers. As Elijah walked the dusty roads towards Zarephath, his mind turned over the peculiar nature of God's provision. Not to a wealthy merchant's house would he go, not to a palace or a place of abundance. God was sending him to a widow, a woman who in that ancient world would have been among the most vulnerable, the most likely to be in need herself. And she was a Gentile, a foreigner, one who did not worship the God of Israel. Yet this was how the Almighty worked, Elijah had learned. He chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, the weak things to shame the strong. He provided for his servants not through the expected channels of power and wealth, but through the humble offerings of those who had little to give but gave it anyway. The journey to Zarephath took Elijah through landscapes that told the story of the drought's devastation. Wells that had once bubbled with clear water stood empty, their stones exposed and cracking in the heat. Fields that should have been green with growing grain stretched out like brown parchment. The soil so hard it rang under his footsteps like pottery. Trees that had weathered centuries of seasons now stood leafless and dying, their branches reaching toward a pitiless sky like the arms of supplicants begging for mercy. In the villages he passed through, Elijah saw the human cost of the judgment he had pronounced. Children with hollow eyes clung to their mothers' skirts, their small faces etched with the premature wisdom that comes from knowing hunger. Men sat in the shade of buildings, their hands idle because there was no work to be done in fields that would not grow. Women walked great distances with empty water jars, returning with barely enough to wet their families' lips. Yet Elijah did not waver in his conviction that he had spoken truly the word of the Lord. This drought would serve its purpose in drawing the hearts of the people back to the God they had abandoned for the seductive promises of Baal, the god of storms and fertility who had proven powerless to bring rain when it was most needed. Sometimes the mercy of God looked like judgment, and the healing had to begin with the pain of truth. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah could smell the salt of the Mediterranean Sea, could hear the distant cry of gulls wheeling over waters that mocked the thirsty land with their abundance. The town spread before him, small and unpretentious, its whitewashed buildings clustered around a modest marketplace. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, and even here, far from Israel, the drought had left its mark in the form of empty gardens and worried faces. Elijah paused at the crest of the hill, looking down at the place where God had promised him provision. Somewhere in that humble town was a widow who would supply him with food, though she herself was surely struggling to survive. The prophet's heart stirred with curiosity and a deep sense of anticipation. What manner of woman would God choose for such a task? What kind of faith would he find in this foreign place? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as Elijah made his way down the hill and through the narrow streets of Zarephath. The town was quiet in the afternoon heat, most of its people taking shelter in the cool shadows of their homes. A few merchants sat listlessly beside their stalls, their wares meagre and their customers few. Children played half-heartedly in the dust, their games subdued by the oppressive weight of want that hung over everything like a heavy blanket. Elijah walked with purpose toward the town gate, the place where travellers traditionally stopped to rest and where the business of daily life was conducted. It was there, God had whispered to his spirit, that he would find the woman who would provide for him. As he approached the gate, his eyes searched the few people moving about in the late afternoon shadows, looking for a sign, a divine indication of which among them was the widow God had prepared. And then he saw her. She was gathering sticks near the city gate, her movements slow and deliberate like someone conserving every ounce of strength for an essential task. Elijah knew immediately that this was the woman God had sent him to find, not through any dramatic sign or heavenly voice, but through the quiet certainty that settled in his spirit like dew on morning grass. The widow of Zarephath was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that indefinite middle season of life, where hope and despair wage their daily battle in a woman's heart. Her dark hair was partially covered by a simple headscarf, and her clothes, though clean and carefully mended, spoke of years of making do with little. Her hands, as she bent to gather the dry branches scattered near the gate, were the hands of one who had worked hard for everything she had ever possessed. There was something in her posture, in the careful way she selected each stick and added it to her small bundle, that spoke of finality. These were not the movements of someone gathering fuel for many meals to come, but of someone preparing for a last act, a final ceremony before surrendering to whatever fate awaited. Elijah approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. In her concentration on her task, she had not yet noticed the travel-worn prophet making his way toward her. When she finally looked up, her eyes registered first surprise, then the wary caution of a woman who had learned to be careful around strangers. "Peace be with you," Elijah said gently. his voice carrying the warmth of one who understood what it meant to be far from home and dependent on the kindness of others. The widow straightened, still holding her bundle of sticks against her chest like a shield. "And with you, traveller," she replied, her voice soft but tinged with the wariness of one who had little left to lose and could therefore afford few mistakes. Elijah gestured toward the well that stood near the gate, its depths long since dry, but its stone rim still serving as a place for travellers to rest. "Could you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" The request was simple enough, the kind of hospitality that travellers routinely requested and that kind hearts routinely provided. But as the widow looked toward the well, Elijah saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of pain that told him water too had become precious in this place. Still she nodded. "I will see what I can do," she said, and began to turn away to fulfill his request. But Elijah's voice stopped her. "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either be crossed or burned. The widow turned back to face him, and now Elijah could see the full weight of her circumstances written in the lines around her eyes, in the slight tremor of her hands as she clutched her bundle of sticks more tightly. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words struck Elijah's heart like physical blows. Here was not abundance hiding behind false modesty, not plenty disguised as poverty. Here was the raw truth of scarcity, spoken with the quiet dignity of one who had already made peace with her fate. This woman was preparing her last meal, gathering these few sticks to kindle a final fire that would cook the final handful of flour into one last piece of bread for herself and her child. In her simple statement, Elijah heard echoes of every widow's story, every mother's nightmare. She had watched her resources dwindle day by day, week by week, had portioned out ever smaller meals until there was nothing left to portion. Now she had reached the end of her rope, the bottom of her jar, the last of her oil. She'd perhaps spent sleepless nights calculating and recalculating, hoping against hope that somehow her meagre supplies would stretch just one more day, one more meal. And here was a stranger, a foreign prophet, asking her to share even this last morsel. Elijah looked into her eyes and saw not just physical hunger, but the deeper starvation of hope deferred, of prayers that seemed to fall on deaf ears, of a God who had seemed absent in her hour of greatest need. Yet he also saw something else, something that made his heart leap with recognition. He saw faith. Not the bold, declarative faith of those who had much to lose, but the quiet, desperate faith of those who had nothing left but trust. The prophet's next words would either build a bridge of hope or collapse the last foundation of this woman's world. He chose them carefully, knowing that he was not speaking merely his own thoughts, but carrying a message from the heart of God himself. "Don't be afraid," Elijah said, his voice gentle but filled with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. "Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." The widow's eyes widened. Was this stranger mad? Was he so callous, so utterly without compassion, that he would ask a dying woman to feed him before she fed her own child? The request seemed to defy every principle of human decency, every natural law of survival and maternal love. But Elijah was not finished speaking. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The promise hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial, the kind of words that could either transform a life or break a heart with false hope. The widow stared at this strange prophet with his wild hair and sun-darkened skin, this man who claimed to speak for the God of Israel, a foreign deity she had heard of but never worshipped. How could she possibly believe such a thing? How could a handful of flour become an endless supply? How could a few drops of oil multiply like the stars of heaven? Every practical bone in her body, every lesson learned through years of careful management and hard-won survival, told her this was impossible. Yet something in Elijah's eyes, something in the quiet confidence with which he spoke these impossible words, awakened an echo in her heart. Perhaps it was the memory of childhood stories her grandmother had told, tales of gods and miracles from the ancient days. Perhaps it was the sheer desperation of a mother who would try anything, believe anything, if it meant one more day of life for her son. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that recognised in this weathered prophet's promise the voice of the same divine love that had sustained her through every previous trial, that had somehow always provided just enough, just when she needed it most, until now. The widow looked down at her bundle of sticks, then back at Elijah. She thought of her son waiting at home, trusting her to return with enough fuel to cook their final meal. She thought of the empty jar that had once held pounds of flour, now scraped clean except for that last precious handful. She thought of the oil jug that had once gurgled with golden liquid, now holding barely enough to moisten the flour into dough. And then she thought of something else, the strange peace that had settled over her heart as Elijah spoke his impossible promise. It was not the peace of understanding, for she understood nothing of what he proposed. It was not the peace of certainty, for everything in her circumstances screamed that his words were foolishness. It was the peace of surrender, the peace that comes when one has exhausted all human possibilities and stands at the edge of mystery, ready to step into the unknown. "I will do as you have said," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo through all eternity. The walk back to her small home felt both eternal and instantaneous to the widow. Each step carried her further from the safety of reasonable despair and closer to the dangerous territory of hope. The bundle of sticks in her arm seemed to grow heavier with each pace, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented, the fuel for a miracle she dared not quite believe in, yet could not quite dismiss. Her house stood at the end of a narrow alley, its walls built of the same white stone as most of the buildings in Zarephath, its roof flat and practical. It was small but carefully maintained, the kind of home that spoke of pride surviving in the face of poverty. A few clay pots stood near the doorway, empty now except for the dust that had settled in them during the long months of drought. As she approached her door, the widow could hear movement inside, the soft sounds of her son moving about in the dim interior. He was perhaps 10 years old, still young enough to trust completely in his mother's ability to provide, yet old enough to understand the gravity of their situation. He had not complained when the meals grew smaller and less frequent, had not questioned why she sometimes gave him her portion, while claiming she wasn't hungry. Now she would have to explain to him that she was going to give away their last food to a stranger. The door opened with a soft creak of wood that had swollen and shrunk through many seasons. Inside, the house was cool and shadowy, a welcome relief from the blazing heat of the afternoon sun. Her son looked up from where he sat near the window, his young face brightening at her return. "Did you find enough wood, Mother?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful optimism of a child who'd learned not to expect too much, but could not quite stop hoping. The widow set down her bundle of sticks and looked around the familiar space of her home. Everything was clean and in its place, though there was precious little to arrange. A few cooking vessels, some worn but serviceable garments, a small table, sleeping mats that she rolled up each morning and spread each evening. The jar of flour sat in the corner where she always kept it, and beside it the small jug of oil. The son followed her gaze to the corner where their last provisions waited. He had watched those containers grow emptier day by day, had seen his mother peer into them each morning with expressions that grew more worried as the contents diminished. He knew, with the intuitive wisdom that children possess, that today would be their last day of having anything to eat. "Mother," he said again, sensing something different in her manner, something that hadn't been there when she left to gather the wood. The widow moved to the corner and lifted the flour jar, feeling the pitiful weight of what remained inside. Then she picked up the oil jug, tilting it slightly to gauge how little was left. The sound of the oil moving in the nearly empty vessel was like a whisper, like the last breath of hope dying away. But then she remembered Elijah's words, remembered the strange certainty in his voice when he spoke of jars that would not empty and jugs that would not run dry. She remembered the peace that had settled over her heart when she agreed to his impossible request. "My son," she said gently, kneeling beside him so they were at eye level. "Something wonderful and strange has happened today. A prophet of the God of Israel has come to our town, and he has asked me to share our food with him." The boy's eyes widened. "Our food? But mother, we only have enough for one meal, yes," she finished for him. "I know, but this prophet, his name is Elijah, has promised me something that seems impossible. He says that if I feed him first, then our jar of flour will not be used up, and our jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The child stared at his mother, processing this information with the serious concentration of one who had learned that adult decisions often determined whether children lived or died. "Do you believe him, mother?" It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything. Did she believe? Could she stake their lives on the promise of a foreign prophet? Could she risk her son's survival on words that defied every law of nature she had ever observed? The widow was quiet for a long moment, looking into her son's trusting eyes. Then she smiled, and it was the first real smile that had crossed her face in months. "I don't know if I believe him with my mind, my son, but my heart tells me that we have nothing left to lose, and perhaps everything to gain. Sometimes faith means stepping forward when you cannot see the path." She stood and moved toward the corner where their supplies waited. "Help me build a fire, and we will make bread for the prophet first, as he asked. And then we will see what the God of Israel will do for a widow and her son in Zarephath." The boy nodded solemnly and began arranging the sticks his mother had gathered while she prepared to perform what might be either an act of supreme faith or supreme foolishness. The distinction, she realized, might not matter as much as she had thought. Working together, they built a small fire outside their door, the flames dancing bright against the darkening sky. The widow poured water into her mixing bowl, then opened the flour jar and looked inside. The handful that remained seemed pitifully small, barely enough for one small loaf, certainly not enough for 2 meals as Elijah had promised. But she had given her word, and more than that, she had felt something stir in her heart when the prophet spoke. Perhaps it was only desperation disguised as faith, but it was all she had to offer. Carefully, reverently, she poured half of the remaining flour into her bowl. Then she tilted the oil jug and let a few precious drops fall into the mixture. The oil gleamed golden in the firelight, and she found herself thinking of ancient stories, half-remembered tales of gods who provided for their people in miraculous ways. As she mixed the flour and oil with water, kneading the small portion of dough with practiced hands, the widow felt a strange sense of ceremony settling over the simple task. This was no ordinary bread-making. This was an act of faith performed in the face of impossible circumstances, a leap into the unknown guided only by the promise of a prophet and the whisper of hope in her own heart. The dough came together under her hands, soft and elastic despite the small amount of oil. She shaped it into a small round loaf and placed it on the flat stone they used for baking, setting it carefully over the coals. The bread began to bake, filling the evening air with the ancient comforting aroma of grain transformed by fire. As they waited for the bread to cook, the widow and her son sat quietly by the fire. The boy leaned against his mother's side, and she wrapped her arm around him, holding him close. Whatever happened next, whatever the morning would bring, they had this moment of peace together. When the bread was finished, golden and warm from the stones, the widow wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth and stood. "I will take this to the prophet now," she told her son. "While I am gone, keep the fire burning. When I return, we'll make our own bread and see if the promise holds true." The walk back to the city gate seemed shorter this time, though the weight of what she carried felt immeasurable. This small loaf represented everything she had left in the world, the last of her resources, the final hedge against starvation. She was literally carrying her life in her hands, offering it to a stranger based on nothing more than his word. Elijah was waiting where she had left him, sitting quietly in the gathering dusk. When he saw her approaching with the wrapped bread, his face lit up with a smile that transformed his austere features. It was not the smile of one who had expected to be obeyed, but of one who was genuinely moved by the sacrifice he was witnessing. "Thank you," he said simply as she placed the bread in his hands. "What you have done requires more courage than facing down armies or calling fire from heaven. You have chosen to trust when you had every reason to doubt." The widow watched as he unwrapped the bread, still warm and fragrant from the fire. "I pray your God honours your promise, prophet. My son and I have nothing left but this hope you have given us." Elijah broke the bread and ate it slowly, savouring each bite not just for its nourishment but for what it represented. "He will honour it," the prophet said with quiet certainty. "Go home now and prepare your own meal. The jar of flour will not be empty." As the widow walked home through the darkening streets of Zarephath, she felt as though she were walking through a dream. Had she really just given away their last food to a stranger? Had she really staked everything on the promise of a foreign god? The practical part of her mind screamed that she had made the most foolish decision of her life. But another part of her, a deeper part that had been silent for so long she had almost forgotten it existed, whispered that she had just participated in something holy, something that would echo through eternity. She had chosen faith over fear, trust over self-preservation, hope over despair. Now she would discover whether faith was strong enough to fill an empty jar. The widow's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the flour jar upon returning home. Her son sat by the fire, his young face illuminated by the dancing flames, watching his mother with the intense attention of one whose very life hung in the balance of what would happen next. The jar felt the same in her hands as it had an hour before, neither heavier nor lighter. There was no external sign that anything miraculous had occurred, no glow of divine presence, no heavenly music announcing supernatural intervention, just a simple clay vessel that might contain their salvation or their final disappointment. The widow closed her eyes for a moment, offering a wordless prayer to whatever divine power might be listening. Then she lifted the jar and looked inside. The flour was there, not overflowing, not abundant, but there. The same handful that had been there before, perhaps even a little more. Enough for another small loaf of bread, enough for one more meal. The widow blinked, wondering if her desperate hope was playing tricks on her vision. She reached into the jar with trembling fingers, feeling the soft texture of the flour, confirming that it was real and not some mirage born of starvation and desperation. "Mother," her son whispered, seeing the wonder in her expression. "Is it true? Is the flour still there?" "It's still here," she replied, her voice filled with amazement. "There's enough for our bread." With reverent hands, she measured out flour for their evening meal, leaving what appeared to be the same small amount in the bottom of the jar. Then she reached for the oil jug, tilting it carefully to pour just enough to bind the flour into dough. The oil flowed golden and pure, and when she set the jug aside, it still contained what seemed to be the same small amount it had held before. As she mixed their bread, the widow felt as though she were participating in something beyond the natural order of things. Each movement of her hands felt sacred, each ingredient holy. This was not just food preparation, this was communion with the divine, a daily miracle made manifest through the simple elements of flour and oil and fire. The bread they ate that night tasted different somehow, though it was made from the same ingredients as countless other loaves she had baked over the years. It tasted of hope, of promise, of a future that extended beyond the next meal. As they shared the warm bread in the light of their small fire, the widow and her son spoke in hushed tones, as if they were in the presence of something too wonderful to fully comprehend. That night, as the widow spread their sleeping mats and prepared for rest, she found herself looking repeatedly toward the corner where the flour jar and oil jug sat. Would they still contain their precious contents in the morning? Or would she wake to find them empty, the miracle revealed as nothing more than a cruel dream? But when dawn broke over Zarephath, painting the walls of her small home with gentle rose-coloured light. The widow's first sight was of the flour jar sitting exactly where she had left it. With her heart pounding, she crept quietly across the room, not wanting to wake her son until she knew whether their hope would survive the night. The flour was there, the oil was there, enough for another day, another meal, another small victory against the spectre of starvation that had haunted their home for so long. And so began a rhythm that would sustain them through the long months of drought that followed. Each morning, the widow would check the jar and jug with a mixture of faith and anxiety, never quite able to take the miracle for granted, always amazed to find their supplies replenished. Each day she would measure out enough for their daily bread, always careful to leave something behind, always trusting that tomorrow would bring the same mysterious provision. Word of the miracle did not spread through Zarephath, for the widow was a careful woman who understood that some blessings were meant to be treasured quietly, rather than proclaimed from rooftops. She continued her daily routines, drawing water when it could be found, tending to her small home, caring for her son. To her neighbours, she appeared to be surviving the drought no better or worse than anyone else. But those who knew her well began to notice subtle changes. The hollow look of desperate hunger faded from her eyes. Her son grew stronger rather than weaker as the drought continued. There was a peace about her that seemed strange in such difficult times, a quiet confidence that suggested she had found a source of strength that the drought could not touch. Elijah became a regular visitor to their home, though he was careful to come and go discreetly, not wanting to draw attention that might put the widow and her son in danger. The prophet had found lodging in a small room at the edge of town, but he took many of his meals with the family he had come to think of as his own. The widow always set a place for him at their modest table, always insisted that there was enough to share. As the weeks turned to months, the relationship between the prophet, the widow and her son deepened into something resembling family. Elijah told them stories of his travels, of the wonders he had seen, and the voice of God he had learned to recognize in wind and whisper. The widow shared the wisdom she had gleaned from years of making do with little, of finding joy in simple things, of holding on to hope when circumstances suggested it was foolish to do so. The boy, who had initially been shy around the imposing prophet, gradually warmed to Elijah's gentle nature and began to see him as something between a grandfather and a teacher. Elijah taught him to read the Hebrew alphabet, to recognize the patterns of weather and season, to understand that the God of Israel was not just a God of the Israelites, but a God who cared for all his children, regardless of their nationality or circumstances. Through it all, the miracle continued. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the jar of flour did not become empty, and the jug of oil did not run dry. Sometimes the widow would peer into the containers and see what appeared to be exactly the same amount as the day before. Other times there seemed to be a little more, as if the divine provider had sensed their need for extra sustenance, or simply wanted to remind them of his abundant love. The miracle was not one of overwhelming abundance. The widow never found her home suddenly filled with grain sacks or her courtyard overflowing with amphorae of oil. The provision was measured daily, sufficient. It was the miracle of enough for today, enough for now, enough to take the next step in faith. As the months passed, the widow began to understand that she was living in the midst of a parable, a living illustration of how divine providence works in the world. God did not promise to fill her storehouses with abundance, but he promised that each day would bring what was needed for that day. It was a lesson in trust, in living one day at a time, in believing that the same power that provided today would provide tomorrow. The drought continued to devastate the land around them. Wells dried up completely, rivers became cracked beds of stone, crops failed utterly. Neighbouring towns reported widespread famine, and travellers brought stories of desperation and death from across the region. Yet in the small home at the end of the narrow alley in Zarephath, a widow and her son and a prophet of God continued to eat bread each day, sustained by flour that did not diminish and oil that did not fail. There were moments when the widow found herself wondering if she was dreaming, if the whole experience was some elaborate fantasy created by a mind pushed to the brink by starvation. But then she would see Elijah's weathered face across their simple table, would hear her son's laughter as he played in the courtyard, would taste the reality of the bread in her mouth, and she would know that she was living in the midst of the miraculous. The widow learned to live with wonder as her constant companion. Each morning brought the possibility of disappointment, yet each morning brought instead the confirmation of promise kept. She learned that faith was not a single dramatic leap, but a daily choice to trust, a daily decision to act on belief rather than sight. As the seasons cycled and the drought persisted, the widow's faith deepened from desperate hope to quiet confidence. She'd seen the faithfulness of God demonstrated not in spectacular signs and wonders, but in the daily grace of provision, in the steady reliability of a promise kept day after day after day. Her son, too, was changed by their experience. The boy who had faced starvation learned that he served a God who provided for his children, who noticed the needs of the small and insignificant, who could be trusted to keep his word even when all evidence suggested otherwise. The lessons he learned at his mother's table, watching flour and oil multiply through divine grace, would shape his understanding of faith for the rest of his life. And Elijah found his own faith strengthened as he witnessed the widow's daily trust. This foreign woman, this Gentile who had no obligation to believe in the God of Israel, demonstrated a quality of faith that put many of his own countrymen to shame. She trusted not because she understood, but because she chose to believe. She obeyed not because the path was clear, but because she was willing to walk into mystery. The miracle of the flour and oil became more than mere physical provision. It became a daily sacrament, a reminder that the God who made the universe was intimately involved in the details of their lives. Every meal was a communion, every shared bread a celebration of divine faithfulness. Through it all, the rhythm of ordinary life continued. The widow swept her floors, mended their clothes, drew what water could be found. Her son played with other children when energy permitted, helped with household tasks, grew taller and stronger despite the famine that surrounded them. Elijah prayed, studied, taught, and waited for the word of the Lord that would eventually send him back to Israel to confront the king and end the drought. But in the quiet moments, when the work was done and the evening meal was finished and they sat together in the glow of their small fire, all three understood that they were witnessing something eternal. They were living proof that God's love extends beyond the boundaries of nation and tribe, that his provision flows to all who trust him, and that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains of impossibility. The widow would often reflect on that first day when Elijah had asked for her last handful of flour. She had stood at the crossroads between fear and faith, between holding tight to what little she had and releasing it into the hands of an unknown God. Her choice to trust, to give when she had nothing left to give, had opened the door to a miracle that sustained not just her body, but her soul. As the months passed, other miracles followed. The widow's health improved, her son grew strong, and their small home became a beacon of hope in a drought-stricken land. Neighbours began to notice that this family seemed to weather the crisis better than most, though they never suspected the divine intervention that made it possible. Elijah taught them that true wealth was not measured in the size of one's storehouses, but in the faithfulness of one's provider. The widow learned that obedience to God's word, even when it seemed to contradict human wisdom, always led to blessing. Her son discovered that the God of Israel was also his God, that divine love knew no boundaries of race or nationality. Years later, when the drought finally ended, and rain fell once again on the parched earth, the widow would remember these days as the most precious of her life, not because they were easy, but because they were holy. In her poverty she had discovered riches. In her weakness she had found strength. In her emptiness she had encountered the fullness of God's love. The jar of flour never ran empty until the day the rains came. The jug of oil never ran dry until the crisis passed. And the faith that began with a handful of flour and a desperate prayer grew into a testimony that would echo through generations, reminding all who heard it that God's provision is always sufficient, his timing always perfect, and his love always faithful. In the quiet of your own heart tonight, as you rest in the peace of this ancient story, remember the widow's courage. Remember that sometimes faith looks like giving when you have nothing left to give, trusting when you cannot see the way forward, believing when all evidence suggests you should despair. Remember that the same God who provided for a widow in Zarephath provides for you today. He sees your needs, knows your fears, and holds your tomorrow in his hands. Sleep now in the assurance that his love surrounds you, his grace sustains you, and his faithfulness will carry you through every season of your life. The jar of flour will not be empty, the jug of oil will not run dry, and the God who multiplied a widow's faith will multiply yours as well, one day at a time, one meal at a time, one breath at a time. Rest well, dear friend. Tomorrow brings new mercies, fresh provision, and the continued unfolding of God's perfect plan for your life. Like the widow of Zarephath, you can trust that there will always be enough. As we close this sacred story tonight, let your heart rest in the truth that the same God who provided for the widow provides for you. In your own seasons of scarcity, whether of resources or hope or strength, remember that divine provision often comes not as abundance but as enough. Enough for today, enough for now. Enough to take the next step in faith. The widow's miracle was not that her cupboards overflowed, but that they never emptied. Sometimes God's greatest gift is not more, but sufficient. Not wealth, but provision. Not ease, but sustenance for the journey. Sleep now, knowing that the Keeper of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, and that his eye is upon you with the same loving attention he showed to a foreign widow in an ancient town. Your jar will not be empty. Your jug will not run dry. His faithfulness endures forever. Rest well, dear soul, rest well. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not. A king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. "I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these?" Jehoshaphat asked carefully, "that we might inquire of him?" The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. "There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah son of Imlah was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, The officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, your majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of 2 kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the Spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool. Despite his many moral failings, he had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd," Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace.'" The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their armies scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political maneuvering they were accustomed to. nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. And the Lord said, Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meagre rations calculated to sustain life, while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home. Absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring, but he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden, sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot, and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king, who had tried to outwit divine judgment, slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. Many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity, while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force, but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance, rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage, inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, may we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth. Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether it's evening where you are, or perhaps the middle of the night, or even early morning on the other side of the world, you're so welcome here. What time is it in your corner of the world right now? And where are you listening from tonight? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet countryside, in the mountains or by the ocean, you belong in this peaceful space we're creating together. If this is your first time with us, welcome to our community of seekers finding rest in ancient wisdom. And if you're returning, thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these moments of peace and reflection that we share together. Now let's settle in as we travel back to ancient Israel, to a time of prophets and miracles, to discover a story about trust, provision, and the surprising ways that hope can multiply in our darkest hours. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty village streets, but Miriam barely noticed its warmth. She stood in the doorway of her small stone house, watching her 2 young sons sleep on their woven mats, their faces peaceful in the golden light. For a moment she allowed herself to pretend that everything was as it had been before the illness took her husband, before the debts mounted like stones upon her chest, before the collectors began their visits with increasingly stern voices and hardening faces. But pretending was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of approaching footsteps made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She knew that measured pace, those heavy sandals against the packed earth. The debt collectors had returned, and this time she knew they would not leave empty-handed. Miriam's husband, Obadiah, had been a good man, a servant in the school of prophets, devoted to following Elisha and learning the ways of the Lord. But goodness, she had learned, did not always translate to prosperity. When the drought had stretched on for months, when the harvest had failed, Obadiah had borrowed money to keep food on their table and oil in their lamps. He had been certain that better times were coming, that the Lord would provide as he always had. Then the fever came, swift and merciless, taking Obadiah before the rains returned, before the debts could be repaid, before he could see his sons grow into men. Now 3 men stood at her threshold, their faces grim with business. The lead collector, a man named Josiah with calculating eyes and soft hands that had never known hard labour, stepped forward. "Miriam, widow of Obadiah," he announced formally, though they all knew each other's names in this small village. "The time for payment has come and gone. Your husband's debts must be settled." Miriam's throat felt as dry as sand. "Please, I have explained our situation. I am a widow with nothing. Give me more time, and I will find a way." "Time is a luxury that costs money," Josiah interrupted, his voice neither cruel nor kind, simply matter-of-fact. "We have been patient, but patience does not feed our families, or pay our own obligations. The law is clear about what must be done when debts cannot be paid." Behind him, the other 2 men shifted uncomfortably. They knew what came next, and while they might not relish it, they would not hesitate to carry out what the law demanded. "Your sons," Josiah continued, his eyes flicking toward the doorway where the boys still slept. "They will come with us. 7 years of service will settle your husband's debt. It is more merciful than we are required to be." The words hit Miriam like a physical blow. She gripped the door frame to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the worn wood. 7 years. Her sons were only 8 and 10 years old. By the time they returned, they would be grown men who barely remembered their mother's face. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, please. They're all I have left. There must be another way." But even as she spoke, she knew the futility of her words. She had nothing of value to offer. No jewellery, no livestock, no land. The house itself belonged to her husband's brother, who had graciously allowed her to remain but could offer no financial help of his own. "I will give you until tomorrow morning to say your goodbyes," Josiah said, and there was perhaps the smallest note of sympathy in his voice. "We will return at sunrise." As the men walked away, their sandals raising small clouds of dust that caught the morning light, Miriam sank to her knees in the doorway. The weight of hopelessness pressed down upon her like a stone, threatening to crush what little breath remained in her lungs. Her sons stirred behind her, waking to another day they assumed would be like all the others. Simple, poor perhaps, but together. How could she tell them that their childhood was about to end? How could she explain that the law that was meant to protect would now tear their family apart? But as the sun climbed higher, and the reality of her situation settled like dust around her, Miriam remembered something her husband used to say when times were difficult. When we have nowhere else to turn, we can always turn upward. Obadiah had learned this truth in his years following the prophet Elisha, and even in death, his faith whispered to her across the veil of grief. Elisha. The prophet was still in the region, still teaching and performing the wonders that had made him famous throughout Israel and beyond. If anyone could help her, if anyone might know a way where there seemed to be no way, it would be the man of God who had been her husband's teacher and guide. Miriam rose to her feet, dust falling from her simple brown robe. She looked back at her sons, now awake and eating the last of their bread, with the unconscious contentment of children who trust that tomorrow will somehow provide for itself. "Aaron, Micah," she called softly, "I must go into the village. Stay close to home and watch out for each other." The boys nodded, accustomed to their mother's brief errands, unaware that she was about to embark on a journey that would either save their family or confirm their worst fears. As Miriam walked through the village streets, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The prophet Elisha was known to be staying with a family on the far side of the village, and with each step she rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain their desperate situation without sounding like she was demanding a miracle. But by the time she reached the modest house where Elisha was lodging, all her carefully planned words had evaporated like morning dew. She stood at the gate, paralysed by the enormity of what she was about to ask and the crushing possibility that even a prophet might not be able to help her. The courtyard was quiet except for the gentle murmur of voices from within the house. Miriam could see Elisha through the open doorway, seated on a low cushion with several young men gathered around him, students perhaps, or local villagers seeking wisdom. His presence was immediately recognisable, not because of any physical grandeur, but because of a quality of stillness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a hearth. Miriam had seen the prophet before, of course. In a village this small, everyone knew when such a significant figure was present. She had watched from a distance as people brought their sick children for healing, their troubled hearts for counsel, their impossible situations for divine intervention. But she had never imagined herself among their number, never thought her own need would drive her to such a desperate act. A woman emerged from the house, evidently the hostess, and noticed Miriam standing uncertainly at the gate. "Can I help you, sister?" the woman asked kindly, but there was a protective quality in her voice. She had probably dealt with many people seeking the prophet's attention. Before Miriam could answer, Elisha's voice came from within. "Let her come. The Lord has brought her here for a reason." The woman's expression immediately softened, and she gestured for Miriam to enter. "Come. The prophet will see you." Miriam's legs felt unsteady as she crossed the threshold. The young men who had been listening to Elisha's teaching respectfully moved aside, creating a space for her to approach. The prophet's eyes, kind but penetrating, met hers, and she felt as though he could see not just her present desperation, but the entire story of her life written in her face. "You are Obadiah's widow," Elisha said gently. It was not a question. Miriam nodded, surprised that he knew her by sight. "Yes, my lord. I am Miriam. Your husband was a faithful servant, both to the Lord and to this community. His loss has been felt by many." Elisha's words were spoken with genuine warmth, and Miriam felt tears prick at her eyes, partly from grief that was still fresh, partly from gratitude that someone remembered her husband's worth. "Thank you, my lord," she managed, "but I have come because—" The words stuck in her throat like thorns. How did one ask a holy man to solve what seemed unsolvable? "Speak freely, daughter. What troubles you?" The kindness in his voice broke through her restraint like water through a cracked dam. The whole story poured out. The debts, the collectors, the threat to take her sons, the sunrise deadline that loomed like an executioner's blade. She spoke of her husband's faithful service, of their family's long devotion to the Lord, of her complete bewilderment at how faithfulness could lead to such devastating circumstances. When she finished, the courtyard was silent except for the distant sound of children playing in another street, a sound that reminded Miriam acutely of what she stood to lose. Elisha listened without interruption, his expression grave but not hopeless. When she fell silent, he sat quietly for a moment, as though listening to a voice only he could hear. Finally he spoke. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The question caught Miriam off guard. What did she have? The very essence of her problem was that she had nothing. No money, no valuables, no resources with which to pay her debts, or provide for her family. "Nothing, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have nothing at all. But Elisha's gaze remained steady, patient. Look again. What do you have in your house? Miriam searched her memory, walking through their small home in her mind. A few pieces of simple furniture, some clay pots, worn clothing, sleeping mats. Nothing of any value. Certainly nothing that could solve a debt large enough to require 7 years of servitude to repay. Then she remembered. There is a small jar of olive oil, she said hesitantly. Just a little. Barely enough for a few meals. She almost apologised for mentioning something so insignificant, but the prophet's face had changed. There was something in his expression now. Not quite a smile, but a kind of quiet intensity that made the air in the courtyard feel charged with possibility. A jar of oil, Elisha repeated thoughtfully. How much oil? Very little, my lord. Perhaps enough to fill a cup, no more. The prophet nodded slowly, as though this small detail was exactly what he had been hoping to hear. He stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Here is what you must do, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke not just his own words, but those of the Almighty. Go to all your neighbours, not just the ones nearby, but throughout the village. Ask them to lend you their empty jars and vessels. Don't ask for just a few. Collect as many as you can carry. Miriam blinked in confusion. Empty jars? What good would empty vessels do when her problem was that she had nothing to fill them with? I don't understand, my lord. If I had oil to fill jars, I would not be in this position. Understanding comes after obedience, not before, Elisha said, but his tone was gentle, not reproving. Trust in the Lord's provision, even when his ways seem strange to our human reasoning. He continued with his instructions. When you have gathered the empty vessels, go into your house with your sons. Close the door. This miracle is not for the curious eyes of the neighbours, but for the desperate faith of a mother. Then take your small jar of oil and begin to pour. Pour into what, my lord? Into the empty jars. Pour until they are full. The instructions seemed impossible, even absurd. How could she pour from a nearly empty jar into multiple vessels? The physical laws that governed their world simply didn't work that way. But as Miriam looked into the prophet's eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. Not madness, not delusion, but absolute certainty. This was a man who had seen the impossible become routine, who had learned to expect miracles the way others expected sunrise. Do you trust me? Elisha asked simply. Miriam thought of her sons, sleeping peacefully this morning while she faced the possibility of never tucking them in again. She thought of her husband's faith, unwavering even in illness, even in poverty, even at the end. She thought of the alternative, doing nothing, accepting defeat, watching her children be led away at sunrise. Yes, my lord, I trust you. Then go. The Lord will not fail you. As Miriam prepared to leave, one of the young men who had been listening spoke up. Master, shouldn't we accompany her? Help her carry the vessels. But Elisha shook his head. This work must be hers alone. Faith cannot be borrowed or carried by another. It must be exercised by the one who needs the miracle. Walking back through the village streets, Miriam felt as though she were in a dream, or perhaps more accurately, as though she had just awakened from the nightmare of the past few months into a reality where impossible things might be possible. The prophet's instructions echoed in her mind. Collect empty jars, as many as possible, then pour from her nearly empty vessel into them. It made no earthly sense. But then again, neither did most of the stories she had heard about Elisha and his master Elijah before him. Prophets who had called down fire from heaven, raised the dead, and fed multitudes with meagre supplies. Perhaps the very impossibility of the instruction was itself a sign that she was about to witness something beyond the natural order. Her first stop was at the house of her neighbour Sarah, an elderly woman who had been kind to Miriam since Obadiah's death, often sharing vegetables from her garden when she had none to spare. Sarah, Miriam called softly at the gate, may I speak with you? The older woman emerged, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Of course, child. You look different somehow. Is everything well? Miriam almost laughed at the question. Nothing was well, and yet somehow Everything felt different than it had this morning. "I need to ask a favour. Do you have any empty jars or vessels that I might borrow?" Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. Empty jars? Whatever for? How could Miriam explain without sounding like she had lost her mind? "The prophet Elisha has given me instructions. I need to gather as many empty containers as I can." To her credit, Sarah didn't ask for further explanation. In a community where prophets occasionally walked among them, people had learned that divine instructions often defied human logic. "I have several clay jars that I use for storing grain, but they're empty now since the harvest was so poor. You're welcome to them. Let me help you carry them." As they loaded the vessels into Miriam's arms, Sarah's expression grew concerned. "Miriam, the whole village knows about your situation with the debt collectors. If there's anything else I can do..." "Pray," Miriam said simply. "Pray that the Lord remembers his promises to care for widows and orphans." Her next stop was at the home of Rebecca, a woman with several children who had always been friendly but not particularly close. Here, Miriam felt more nervous about making her request. "Rebecca, I know this will sound strange, but I need to borrow any empty jars or pots you might have." Rebecca looked puzzled but not unfriendly. "Empty jars? Are you planning to store something? I heard about your troubles. Surely you're not thinking of buying oil or grain?" "No, nothing like that. The prophet Elisha has asked me to collect empty vessels. I'm not entirely sure why, but I trust that he knows what he's doing." At the mention of Elisha's name, Rebecca's demeanour changed immediately. "The prophet gave you instructions? Of course, take whatever you need." "Children," she called into the house. "Bring out all the jars and pots we're not using, quickly now." Soon Miriam's arms were full again, and Rebecca's children were helping to carry the additional vessels. Word seemed to be spreading through the village. She could see neighbours emerging from their houses, curious about the unusual activity. By the time she reached the house of David the Potter, she didn't even need to make her request. He was already waiting with an armload of clay vessels, not his finest work, but good serviceable jars in various sizes. "I heard you were collecting empties on the prophet's instructions," he said with a grin. "I've got plenty of these. Consider it my contribution to whatever miracle is about to happen." "You really think there will be a miracle?" Miriam asked, suddenly feeling the weight of what she was attempting. So many people were now involved, so many witnesses to what would either be a tremendous demonstration of God's power or a devastating display of her own foolishness. David's expression grew serious. "I've lived in this village for 40 years, and I've seen 3 different prophets pass through. Not once have I seen one of them give instructions that didn't lead to something remarkable. The real question isn't whether there will be a miracle, it's whether we'll have enough faith to receive it." As Miriam continued through the village, she was amazed by the response. People she barely knew were offering their vessels, and those who had no jars to spare were spreading the word to others who might. Children ran ahead of her, announcing to each household what was needed. Even some of the village elders, usually stern and cautious about anything that disrupted the normal order, were nodding their approval and contributing what they could. By mid-afternoon, Miriam's small house was surrounded by more clay vessels than she had ever seen in one place. There were large storage jars that could hold enough oil for a family for months, medium-sized pitchers perfect for daily use, and small vessels suitable for lamps and cooking. Some were beautifully crafted, others rough and practical. Some were new, others showed the wear of years of faithful service. Her sons, Aaron and Micah, had awakened to find their home transformed into something resembling a pottery merchant's stall. They helped carry the vessels inside, their eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "Mother, what are all these for?" Aaron asked. At 10, he was old enough to sense that something significant was happening, but young enough to find it more exciting than frightening. "We're going to fill them," Miriam said, the words sounding even stranger when spoken aloud to her children. "Fill them with what?" 8-year-old Micah wanted to know. Miriam looked at the small jar of oil sitting on their simple wooden table, the same jar she had mentioned to the prophet, containing perhaps a cup's worth of precious olive oil. It looked impossibly small, surrounded by all the empty vessels now crowding their one-room home. "With oil," she said, and saw her sons exchange the kind of look children give when they're certain their parent has said something that makes no sense but are too polite to argue. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Miriam stood in her doorway one last time before following the prophet's final instruction. The village around her looked the same as it had this morning, but everything had changed. This morning she'd been a desperate woman with no options. Now she stood on the threshold of either a miracle or a disaster. But at least she was no longer passive in the face of her circumstances. She could see a few neighbours lingering in their own doorways, clearly curious about what would happen next. News of the prophet's instructions had spread throughout the village, and while no one was bold enough to ask for details, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though the entire community was holding its breath. Tomorrow morning the debt collectors would return, expecting to claim her sons, but tonight belonged to faith, to the impossible, to the hope that a God who had parted seas and raised the dead might still care about one widow's desperate prayer. "Come, boys," she said, stepping back inside their small home. "It's time to close the door." The interior of their small house felt different with the door closed and the outside world shut away. The late afternoon light filtered through the single window, casting long shadows among the collection of empty vessels that now filled nearly every available space. Aaron and Micah stood close to their mother, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary, though they couldn't possibly understand what. Miriam picked up the small jar of oil with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear now, but from anticipation. The prophet had been so certain, so confident in his instructions. But looking at the meagre amount of oil in her jar compared to the dozens of empty vessels surrounding them, she felt the weight of impossibility settling over her like a heavy cloak. "Mother," Aaron said quietly, "how can we fill all these jars with so little oil?" It was the question that had been echoing in her own mind, but hearing it from her son's lips made her realise that this moment was about more than just solving their financial crisis. Her children were watching, learning what it meant to trust when trust seemed foolish, to obey when obedience seemed pointless, to hope when hope seemed dead. "I don't know how, my son," she said honestly, "but the prophet told us to pour, so we will pour. Sometimes we must act on faith before we understand the reason." She moved to the largest jar first, a beautiful vessel that David the potter had contributed, large enough to hold oil for several months. As she lifted her small jar and positioned it over the opening, she whispered a prayer. "Lord God of Israel, you who cared for the widow of Zarephath in the days of Elijah, remember your servant and his children." The oil began to flow. At first it seemed natural. The golden liquid poured from her jar into the larger vessel with the normal splash and gurgle of any liquid being transferred. But as seconds passed, then minutes, Miriam realised that something impossible was happening. The oil continued to flow, steady and smooth, and yet when she looked at her own jar, it appeared as full as when she had started. "Mother," Micah whispered, his young voice filled with awe, "it's still coming." The first large jar filled completely, rich golden oil reaching its brim. Miriam looked at her own vessel, still full. Her hands began to shake, not with fear now, but with the overwhelming realization that she was witnessing the divine intervention of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "Bring me another jar," she said, her voice barely steady. Aaron quickly positioned a medium-sized pitcher beside her, and Miriam continued to pour. Again the oil flowed freely, filling the second vessel completely, while her own jar remained miraculously replenished. "Another," she said, and now her voice carried a note of growing excitement. Micah dragged over a small storage jar, and the process repeated. The oil flowed, the vessel filled, and still her small jar remained full to the brim. As they continued, a rhythm developed. The boys would position each new vessel, Miriam would pour until it was full, then they would move it aside and bring the next one. With each jar they filled, their excitement grew, and what had begun as nervous obedience transformed into joyful celebration. "It's not stopping," Aaron laughed, no longer trying to whisper in the presence of miracle. "Mother, it's really not stopping." Miriam found herself laughing too, tears of relief and wonder streaming down her face as she poured jar after jar. The oil continued to flow, inexhaustible, impossible, absolutely real. This was the God her husband had served, the God who had parted the Red Sea and provided manna in the wilderness, and he was here in their small house, multiplying oil for a desperate widow and her children. The sun set completely as they worked, and Aaron lit their oil lamp, using oil from one of the newly filled jars. The warm light danced across the growing collection of filled vessels, each one a testament to divine provision, each one a step away from the disaster that had threatened to destroy their family. They filled the large storage jars first, then the medium pitchers, then the smaller vessels for daily use. Oil for cooking, oil for lamps, oil for anointing, oil for trade. More oil than their family could use in a year, more than they could use in several years. "Mother," Micah said during a brief pause, "will we ever run out of empty jars?" Miriam looked around their home. They had filled perhaps half of the vessels they had collected, and still the oil flowed freely from her small jar. "I hope not, my son. I hope we never run out." But even as she spoke, she realized they were approaching the end of their supply of empty containers. Only a handful of vessels remained unfilled, the smallest ones suitable for perfumes and medicines. As she filled the second-to-last jar, a delicate little vessel that Rebecca had contributed, Miriam felt a change. The oil still flowed, but there was something different in its quality, as though it was beginning to recognize that its work was nearly complete. She reached for the final jar, the smallest one in the collection, barely large enough to hold oil for a single lamp. As she positioned her small jar above it and began to pour, the oil flowed out in a steady stream, filling the tiny vessel to its brim. And then, as suddenly as the miracle had begun, it stopped. Miriam tilted her jar, trying to coax out even a few more drops, but it was empty. Completely, naturally, normally empty, as though the laws of physics had suddenly remembered themselves and returned to their usual operation. The silence that followed was profound. For hours their small house had been filled with the sound of flowing oil, excited whispers, and occasional exclamations of wonder. Now, surrounded by dozens of filled vessels, they stood in the golden lamplight and absorbed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Aaron was the first to speak. "Is it over?" Miriam looked at her empty jar, then at the abundance surrounding them. "Yes, my son, it's over because we have no more empty vessels to fill." "What does that mean?" Micah asked. Before Miriam could answer, she remembered something the prophet had implied in his instructions. The miracle was not limited by the amount of oil God could provide, but by the amount of faith they could exercise, represented by the number of empty vessels they had been able to gather. "It means," she said slowly, understanding dawning on her like sunrise, "that God's provision is only limited by our capacity to receive it. If we had gathered 100 jars, he would have filled 100 jars. If we had gathered 1,000... The implications took her breath away. They had gathered many vessels, yes, but now she wondered, could they have gathered more? Had their own limited vision constrained the miracle? It was a question that would follow her for the rest of her life, a reminder to always ask for more, expect more, prepare for more when seeking God's intervention. But such thoughts were for later reflection. Tonight, surrounded by the tangible evidence of divine love and provision, there was only gratitude and wonder. "Tomorrow," she told her sons as they prepared for sleep among the filled vessels, "we will go to the prophet and then to the marketplace. We will sell this oil, pay our debts, and secure our future." As her boys settled onto their sleeping mats, their faces glowing with excitement and the security of knowing they would not be taken away, Miriam sat beside the window and looked out at the village where she had lived her entire life. Tomorrow she would no longer be known as the desperate widow who had nothing. She would be the woman whom God had remembered, the mother whose children had been saved, the recipient of a miracle that would be told and retold for generations. But tonight she was simply a woman who had learned that emptiness was not the absence of provision, but the presence of possibility, and that sometimes the most important thing you can bring to God is not what you have, but what you lack. The oil lamps flickered gently in the darkness, fueled by the miracle oil casting dancing shadows on the walls of their transformed home, and in the quiet of the night, Miriam whispered prayers of thanksgiving to the God who multiplies hope in the hands of those who dare to pour out their faith. one empty jar at a time. Morning came with a gentle golden light that seemed especially bright as it streamed through the window of their small house. Miriam awakened to a sight that confirmed the previous evening had not been a dream. Dozens of clay vessels filled with rich golden olive oil crowded every surface and corner of their home. Aaron and Micah were already awake, sitting among the jars with expressions of continued amazement, as though they expected the oil to disappear with the sunrise. "It's still here," Aaron said wonderingly. "All of it." "Did you think it wouldn't be?" Miriam asked, though she understood his disbelief. Miracles had a quality of unreality about them, even to those who experienced them directly. "I dreamed about it," Micah said. "I dreamed that we were pouring oil forever and ever, and there were jars as tall as trees, and the oil turned into rivers that flowed through the whole village." Miriam smiled at her younger son's imagination, but then paused to consider his words. In a way, wasn't that exactly what had happened? The oil had flowed beyond their immediate need, beyond their ability to contain it all, beyond what seemed possible in their small, constrained world. A knock at their door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window she could see the familiar figure of Elisha standing in their courtyard, his presence as calm and assured as it had been the day before. "The prophet," Aaron whispered excitedly. Miriam quickly adjusted her headscarf and opened the door, her heart racing with anticipation and gratitude. "My lord," she said, bowing respectfully, "please, come in and see what the Lord has done." Elisha entered their transformed home, his eyes taking in the abundance with what appeared to be satisfaction, but not surprise. This was clearly not the first time he had witnessed the Lord's provision in response to desperate faith. "It is well," he said simply, then looked directly at Miriam. "Tell me what happened." Though he had given the instructions and surely knew what to expect, Miriam realized he wanted to hear her testimony, to let her put into words the miracle she had experienced. So she told him everything: the gathering of vessels, the closing of the door, the first hesitant pour, the growing amazement as jar after jar filled with oil that seemed to come from an inexhaustible source. "We filled every vessel we had collected," she concluded. "When the last jar was full, the oil stopped flowing." Elisha nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you understand from this?" The question surprised her. She had expected congratulations, perhaps instructions for what to do next, but not an examination of her theological understanding. I understand that the Lord remembers his promises to care for widows and orphans," she said slowly, "and that his provision is beyond what we can imagine or contain." "Yes," Elisha agreed. "And what else?" Miriam thought about the experience, about the rhythm of pouring and filling, about the moment when the oil finally stopped. "The miracle was limited only by our preparation," she said, with growing insight. "If we had gathered more vessels—" "The oil would have continued to flow," Elisha confirmed. "God's provision is not constrained by scarcity, but by our capacity to receive abundance. Remember this lesson, and teach it to your sons." He moved toward the door, then turned back with final instructions. "Now go. Sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons will live on what remains." "How much should I sell?" Miriam asked, suddenly practical concerns rushing back as she realized she had no experience as a merchant. "Take the oil to the marketplace in portions. Don't flood the market all at once, or you'll drive down the price. Sell slowly, over time, and you'll receive full value. The Lord has given you not just provision for today, but wisdom for managing tomorrow." After the prophet left, Miriam stood in her doorway watching his retreating figure until he disappeared around a corner. Then she turned back to face her transformed reality. The first practical task was obvious. She needed to begin transporting oil to the market. But first there was another matter to address. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. 3 familiar figures were walking down her street, the debt collectors, returning as promised at sunrise to claim her sons. But this time Miriam felt no fear, no desperate helplessness. She stood calmly in her doorway, watching their approach with something approaching pity for men who lived in a world too small to contain miracles. "Miriam," Josiah called as they drew near, "are you prepared to surrender the boys?" "I am prepared to pay the debt," she replied evenly. The three men stopped walking, clearly taken aback by her confident tone. "Pay the debt?" Josiah repeated sceptically. "Yesterday you claimed to have nothing. What has changed overnight?" "The Lord has provided," Miriam said simply. "I now have the means to settle my husband's obligations in full." She gestured toward her house, where several of the oil jars were visible through the open doorway. Olive oil of the finest quality, more than enough to cover what is owed, with plenty remaining for my family's future needs. The debt collectors exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. "Where did you get oil?" one of them asked suspiciously. "You cannot simply produce valuable goods from nothing." "With the Lord, nothing is impossible," Miriam replied. "But if you doubt the quality or value, you are welcome to examine it for yourself." Josiah stepped forward and peered into the house, his eyes widening at the sight of dozens of filled vessels. He dipped his finger into the nearest jar and tasted the oil, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. "This is premium oil," he admitted reluctantly, "worth far more than your husband's debt." "Then we are agreed," Miriam said. "I will deliver payment to you within 3 days once I have sold sufficient oil in the marketplace." The three men departed, shaking their heads in bewilderment, leaving Miriam alone with her sons and their miraculous abundance. Over the following weeks, Miriam carefully sold portions of the oil at the market, following Elisha's wise counsel. The oil was of such exceptional quality that merchants competed to purchase it, and word spread throughout the region about the widow's premium product. True to her word, she paid her husband's debts in full within the promised time, but the oil continued to provide for their family month after month, year after year. She was able to purchase their house from Obadiah's brother, expand their small business, and ensure her sons received proper education. Aaron and Micah grew into strong, faithful men who never forgot the night they witnessed their mother pour from an empty jar and receive abundance beyond measure. They told the story to their own children and grandchildren, how God had multiplied oil in the hands of a desperate widow who dared to trust when trust seemed impossible. Years later, when Miriam was an old woman surrounded by prosperity and family, people would ask her about the secret of her success. She would always smile and say, "The miracle was not in the oil that multiplied, but in the faith that dared to pour from an empty jar. God is not limited by what we lack. He's only limited by our willingness to bring him our emptiness and trust him to fill it." And in the evenings, when the oil lamps flickered in homes throughout the village, many still burning oil that traced its origins back to that miraculous night, the people would remember that sometimes the greatest abundance comes not when our jars are full, but when we have the courage to pour from what little we have, trusting that the God who created the universe from nothing can certainly create provision from our emptiness. The widow's oil became more than a solution to debt. It became a testament to the truth that faith, like oil, multiplies when poured out in trust, and that the God who notices empty jars is the same God who delights in filling them beyond our wildest dreams. For in the end, Miriam learned the most important lesson of all. We bring our emptiness to God not as a sign of our failure, but as an invitation for his abundance. And when we dare to pour out our faith, even from the smallest jar, we discover that his provision knows no limits except those we place on our own capacity to receive. The story of the widow's oil echoed through generations, a reminder that in the hands of the Almighty, even our deepest need can become our greatest testimony to his faithfulness.